In this video, we are going to talk about wishful thinking considered as a fallacy of argumentation. So we are going to look at what wishful thinking is, and then we'll take a closer look at the structure of that kind of argument. We'll talk about what makes it a bad argument or inference, what's wrong with it. Then we'll look at some common situations in which it's likely to occur. We'll zero in on 3 specific examples of the fallacy. We'll talk about some of the red flags that you should be on guard for how to spot it. And then for those of you who are students and need to be able to distinguish it from other fallacies, we'll talk about some of the other fallacies it might get mistaken for. We'll finish up by talking about how you can avoid falling into this fallacy in your own thinking, communication, inference, your own life. So let's talk first about what this thing is in the first place. Wishful thinking, and we don't really have any synonyms for this one, the way we do for many other fallacies. What wishful thinking involves is believing that some sort of claim is true because one, for whatever reason, desires to believe that it's true, or because one desires not to believe that an opposed claim is true. Now, this can include accepting a whole bunch of different claims, or it could just be centered on one main claim. You could be accepting other dubious claims as evidence because you'd like to think that the main claim is true and those happen to provide spurious backing for them. If we look at the structure of this fallacy, it's actually pretty simple and pretty straightforward. There's nothing super complex going on here. Notice that one of the premises is I desire X to be true, and then the conclusion is X is true. Now the question that you have to ask is, well, how did you get from desiring something to be true to it being true? Well, there's an implicit premise. There's something being assumed there. And once we bring that out into the sunlight, they say sunlight is the best antiseptic. Well, this is kind of one of those bugs that you would want to introduce the antiseptic to and kill it off with. Because we've got this implicit premise that says, well, when I desire X to be true, that's a good reason to think X is true. And that's clearly not the case. Unless you happen to live in a universe where everything that you desire happens to be true because you desire it, in which case I suppose you would be something like God. But if you're not God, then this could be a logical fallacy, right? And so when we look at it like this, we can see that there's a real problem with this kind of argument, and the problem is that premise that connects the other premise and the conclusion together. If we look at this in graphic terms, it's very easy to represent. You see we've got a desire for X to be true, and we put that together with this general idea that if I desire something to be true, it is, and we come up with the conclusion X is actually true. And that's sort of a recipe for all sorts of disasters. Now, going a little bit more in depth, why is this a fallacy? What's wrong with this kind of thinking? So there's a couple different things we can point out. One is it's substituting a desire for a claim to be true in place of good reasons to think that that claim is true. That's always a bad idea. Why? Well, because whether a claim is true or not does not, in general, depend on whether a person desires it to be true or not. I mean, there could be some exceptions where the claim is something like, I desire I desire there to be spaghetti for dinner tonight. Now, the claim there is spaghetti for dinner tonight, that's a whole different ballgame. But the mere reference to I desire that, if I claim I do indeed have that desire, that claim is sort of trivially true because I want it to be true, right? But in general, things don't work like that, do they? There's a disconnect between our desires and the way things actually are. Sometimes they happen to mesh up together, sometimes they don't. So another thing to keep in mind, too, what would the world be like if we actually bought into this kind of reasoning? Don't different people sometimes have very different, even competing desires about what's true and what's false? So if I want, something to be particularly true, because, or if I particularly want something to be true. It's not that something can't be particularly true. That's a silly thing to say. But I particularly want something to be true, and you particularly want the opposite to be true. If we were to buy into this line of reasoning, well, whatever it is both true and false at the same time, because I really desire it and you really desire the opposite. That would lead to a world of nonsense, wouldn't it? Wishful thinking also tends to lead people to give credence to what will support the claim that they desire to be true. That's why this is often treated not so much under the guise of a fallacy, but as a cognitive bias, a way in which we keep ourselves from acquiring good information or from filtering out bad information. What are some common situations in which you're going to see this occurring? So wishful thinking occurs in a lot of different contexts. Politics is a great example. I'm actually going to have one example of that. But, there's a lot of wishful thinking that happens both about one's own side and about one's opponents, about how successful something is going to be, how, somebody else's proposal is going to destroy humanity in general. We could go on and on and on about who's going to support, who's going to attack, all those sorts of things. Education. It's a dirty little secret, but there's an awful lot of wishful thinking that goes on in our K through 12 classrooms where people are, reporting things that might not necessarily be totally true because they would like to think that they're that way. Parents reading report cards sometimes engage in wishful thinking. Oh, little Tommy has got all F's, but I think he's going to pass and he won't have to go to summer school this year. That's probably wishful thinking, right? And I think that teachers do a lot of wishful thinking about just how much of an impact they actually have. I think that's one reason why teachers are so scared about assessments. Now, there's a lot of bad assessments out there. Matter of fact, we could talk about wishful thinking in terms of whether standardized tests really measure anything that's tangible and substantive. There's a lot of wishful thinking built into that, but there's probably also a lot of wishful thinking built into the, more, loosey-goosey approach as well, that, our students are coming out of here learning something. As a matter of fact, this is, a little bit of a digression here and a little bit of specificity. There was that wonderful book, Academically Adrift, that came out having to do with college students just a few years ago, in which they noticed that college students in general were not coming out of college having acquired a lot more skills than they went in with. There wasn't an awful lot of value added. And schools and professors and administrators were kind of pretending to themselves that a lot more education was taking place. And the students were too. The workplace. I think that there's an awful lot of wishful thinking that takes place within the workplace in all different varieties. Religion, I'm not going to say that religion is reducible to wishful thinking because I think that would be a very reductive way to treat it. But I do think that within religious context, we can find an awful lot of wishful thinking going on, often by people who don't really know their own tradition and its teachings very well. Self-help, self-help. Much of it is really based on exploitation of this line of reasoning. Among the people that are being sold products or who are reading and purchasing them. That leads us to sales, consumption, and purchasing. There's an entire industry out there that's based around trying to make us think that products that we buy are actually going to improve our lives in a whole variety of ways. And there's an awful lot of disappointment that goes on. Some people are willing to look that disappointment straight in the face. Other people have to keep on pretending that somehow this product actually made things better, or that it's a better product than it is. Last one I'm going to bring up: relationships. This is a real problem because sometimes we're engaging in wishful thinking about somebody that we're involved with and the way that they treat us, or the attitudes that they take towards other people, and we make excuses for them. We don't want to think that they're not a good person because that bothers us. We'd like to think things are better than they are. Sometimes it's us, actually, who are engaging in wishful thinking about the kind of people that we are, and we do a lot better to actually listen to the people that are telling us that we're jerks so we can quit being jerks. Sometimes that can be, the right thing to hear. There is one other thing I want to point out, too. Wishful thinking has been used in particular as a strategy, sort of a basic building block for what we call positive thinking, for visualization, and for other similar practices. These are used in a wide variety of settings. I'm not saying that they're necessarily bad, but from a critical thinking perspective, quite often they represent an undue optimism that isn't based in any sort of real ground. So we want to be careful about that sort of thing from a critical thinking perspective. Let's look at a few examples now. So this one is a classic one. The lottery is a great investment. And I'm actually going to tell you a little story as soon as I go through this one about something that happened to me in my own life. Actually, I'll tell you two stories about the lottery. So let me do the example first. No, I don't read those odds on the back of the tickets. I'm going to win one of these days if I just stick with it. You got to keep your hopes up. And so the conclusion is I should keep on buying lottery tickets. Now, lottery tickets are a terrible investment. They're not even a good investment, usually for the things that they're supposed to be supporting. Usually they're going to go towards education or stuff like that. They amount to a new kind of tax on people. Some people want to call it a stupidity tax, but it's usually an uninformed or innumeracy tax, and I think that's kind of unfair. So I'm going to tell you two stories. One was I knew a guy, and he had a system for the lottery. This is actually, in some ways, a different kind of fallacy. And he would keep track every night about what the Powerball numbers were. And he, his idea was he was going to pick the number that hadn't come up yet. So he'd look at all the numbers and he'd just kind of come to a feel about what it was likely to be. Then he'd buy himself a ticket. And usually that ticket wouldn't get anything, and now it would go back into his book. Now that's not a good strategy. Another thing that I saw an awful lot when I sold lottery tickets when I worked as a gas station and convenience store attendant, I'd have people who'd come in and they'd buy 50 scratch-off tickets at a crack. And I felt bad selling it to them because I would read the odds on the back. Now, they would not win on most of those tickets. And very occasionally somebody would actually win more than they put in. Usually they'd win like maybe $20 back or something like that on $50. Then they'd turn that into more tickets, 20 more tickets, and then they'd scratch those off, and those might turn into 10. And eventually they would get to the point where if there wasn't any money left, they'd go on through it, they'd wasted about half an hour of their time, my time, and they were out $50. Now, if it was a good deal because they got a real charge out of it, that's great. But most of those people were actually using this kind of reasoning here. And they thought that, sooner or later they're bound to hit the big win. And we know by looking at the statistics that that's just not the case. So lottery tickets are not a good investment. Let's look at the next one. What should we do about it? This is about global warming. If the global warming we're observing is caused by human beings, then we can and ought to take measures to slow it down or even reverse the damage. But I'd rather not think that we human beings have a role in global warming because that might imply that my lifestyle needs to change. This, by the way, not only applies to conservatives, but also applies to hypocritical liberals who are living an environmentally damaging lifestyle, driving their Hummers around and taking private jets and things like that. So the conclusion is human-caused global warming must not be taking place. It must be cyclical global warming, because if it's cyclical, the sun's to blame, and then we don't have to worry about it. But if we're to blame, then we actually have to do something about it. So, I think that a lot of people engage in wishful thinking about global warming, and they tend to blur a lot of issues together so that they don't have to take, the responsibility for thinking about lifestyle changes that they would have to otherwise. Here's another great example. My candidate must win. There's so many people disappointed after elections. I remember the 2004 election, and I had all these, liberal academic friends that were just aghast. How could Bush possibly win? Nobody I know likes the guy. And, there's a lot of people who engage in wishful thinking about their candidate or how popular their cause is, and they don't want to look at the reality of things. So, Here's how this sort of line goes. I know the current polls show that my candidate is currently a bit behind in most of the key states that will decide this presidential election. It's a bad sign right there, right? But I can't bear to think about my candidate losing or that other candidate winning. So I'm sure that my candidate will somehow pull through in the battleground states and win the election. Now, the candidates, they have to say that sort of thing, because if they don't, they're giving up, right? And they've already put so much time and labor and money usually into it and political connections. But the ordinary person on the street could afford to be a little bit more realistic about the prospects of their candidate actually winning. If you're supporting Romney against Obama in 2012 and you look at the battleground states and the polls and you say, well, there's a pretty low chance that this guy is going to win, it's wishful thinking to say, oh, I'm sure that somehow more people are going to turn out and these states are going to turn. If you're, in other cases like the Democrats in 2004, similar sort of thing going on there. So these are all some good examples. How do you spot this fallacy? What should you be on the lookout for? One is pay attention to whether good reasons or grounds or evidence are being supplied for a claim, or whether its truth is being made to rest on a person's desire for it to be true. If it's primarily resting on hopes and dreams, that's probably a good sign there's some wishful thinking going on there. Also, be on guard for people dismissing a claim as true because they desire to think that it's false, or because its truth would make another claim they desire to be true to be false. So this is the cognitive bias of not paying attention to disconfirming information. That's another thing that wishful thinkers tend to do. Another thing to pay attention to, the wishful thinking can extend to other claims that are used to support the original claim. So those could be instances of wishful thinking. And also, watch out for people who tend to, as a habit, determine whether claims are true or false on the basis of whether they desire them to be true or false. Those are people that are more likely to commit this fallacy than the ordinary person. Now, if you're a student, one of the things that you often have to do in classes is be able to distinguish fallacies from each other. Sometimes this fallacy won't even show up in your textbooks, depending on what textbook you're using. But, if it is, we can distinguish it from a couple other fallacies. Some arguments that are involving an appeal to emotions, because this is an appeal to emotion, are instead appeal to fear. So, for example, when a person is being made to feel fear in order to get them to accept or reject a claim, it's going to be the appeal to fear rather than to wishful thinking. Wishful thinking is, I would like this to be true. Appeal to fear is something bad is going to happen if this isn't true. Arguments that appeal to emotion by making a person feel good about themselves are probably more likely the appeal to vanity or appeal to pride. And we've looked at that in another video. We've also looked at the appeal to fear in another video. So you can see some of the distinctions between those. And be on guard, too, because not every argument that involves a claim that a person does desire to be true is necessarily a fallacy. Just because I desire a claim to be true doesn't mean that I'm not providing some good grounds for a reasonable person to believe that it's true, independent of my own desires, independent of their desires. So not every case is going to be fallacious. Now, how do you avoid falling into this yourself? Pay attention to your own reasoning and claims. If you're a critical thinker, you should be watching yourself a good bit of the time to make sure that you're not doing this sort of thing. Pay attention to whether you accept claims on the basis of your desires, desiring the claims to be true or not. Make it an ongoing practice. This is something you have to do over time to align your beliefs and assertions with what you have good grounds to accept, not what you desire to be true. Because there's a lot of things that you wish would be true that aren't really true. And a critical thinker strips those away and recognizes, look, this isn't the case. I'm not going to pretend that it is the case. This over here that I like less is the case. If you find yourself falling into this, accepting a claim primarily on the basis of a desire for it to be true, see whether you can find other good grounds to believe that it's true. It could be that it really is true. But you shouldn't believe something just on the basis of desiring it to be the case. The last thing I'm going to say is that this video is part of a series discussing common fallacies, and it belongs to a channel devoted specifically to critical thinking, logic, and argumentation. So if you like this video, if you found this useful, if you think that other people would benefit from it, share it, and come back and check out the other videos and the ultimately other series that we're going to offer in this channel.